Hey guys, I'm an INTJ and I've been working in the software industry for the last 12 years. And I wanted to make a video about some of the experiences I've had working with INTPs. I'm going to make some broad generalization about INTPs here that is obviously not going to apply to everyone. But I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you'll take away some insights that may help you as an INTJ work with other INTPs, or other INTPs help other INTPs work with INTJs, and vice versa. So I'm not going to go into the details of type theory, cognitive functions, what these types are. I assume that if you're watching this video that you have a pretty good understanding of who's an INTJ and who's an INTP. And I won't go into details about what a good understanding is. So let's get to it. So having been in the tech industry for a little over a decade, I've encountered my share of INTPs in various positions in the corporate hierarchy and startups. I've managed INTPs, I've worked on the same level as them, and I've also reported to INTPs. And working with INTPs is a double-edged sword for me. So I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of the work relationship and some of the challenges that I've encountered from my point of view. And I'll speculate on what their point of view is like, some of the issues that they probably had working with me and other INTJs in my company. So this is going to be, filled with anecdotes. It's not a scientific thing, but I'm hoping that by the end you will have gleaned some insights. So first of all, the primary difference between INTJs and INTPs is the N and the P versus the N and the J. And I think that's the thing that stands out the most in a work setting. As NJs, I think INTJs like to project a singular focus into the future. So at least in myself, before I start on a project, I have a vision of what I'm trying to build. I have a vision of all the obstacles that I'm going to encounter along the way. So I have a very clearly defined destination in my mind before I engage in any sort of project. As such, there's also a certain rigidity that comes with that, because I have to first commit to that vision before implementing things. Whereas with INTPs and most NPs, in my experience, they tend to sort of have an open-ended outlook on projects. So when they start a project, they're okay with not having all of the vision figured out. As a result, they tend to be a little more process-oriented, and they tend to just build up on things as they come. It doesn't need the final form. It doesn't really come to fruition until they get to the end. Whereas I start with a template or an ideal of what the project or the outcome is supposed to be, and work towards that. For this reason, I generally find that I experience a sense of urgency and also a sense of frustration when I have to deviate from that commitment, or when distractions come up. And it's been a strength for me in my career, because I can focus hard and work in a steady fashion towards that one goal, get that out of the way, and then move on to something else. Whereas with INTPs, it seems like the open-ended exploration is an end in itself, so they don't really have that. So that would be the first difference in how we approach projects. When I've had to report to INTPs in the past, it's been a frustration for me because they don't have everything figured out. They just give me piecemeal information, and I need to see the complete picture before I start a project, or I feel a little bit condescended. But I also just get frustrated because my introverted intuition is constantly projecting based on incoming data, and it can be energetically expensive to do that. So first difference is INTJs have a vision projected into the future that's somewhat concrete, whereas INTPs tend to improvise and build things and as requirements surface, and they're generally okay with adding layers and changes to their designs. So in that sense, INTJs tend to be more focused and rigid when it comes to goals and vision, whereas INTPs tend to be more open-ended. Obviously, from the INTP's point of view, for this point, they're going to find me too rigid, too private, and too far-sighted, because as far as they're concerned, my vision is a subjective vision, and arguably it is, but it's based on abstractions that I've collected by looking at patterns and bits and pieces here and there. So from their point of view, it seems like they find that my ideal vision is not justified, and it's too narrow, and it's not fluid enough to accommodate new information. So that's the first difference. The second difference is how we make decisions. So for me, I tend to rely on group consensus to make a lot of decisions. Even if there's a technical decision that needs to be made that's subpar, or let's just say not the most up to date with the recent trends and design patterns and so on and so forth, I factor in the likelihood of success, the likelihood of it being accepted into the group or into superiors' minds as a factor when I evaluate frameworks and design patterns and decisions and stuff like that. Whereas INTPs have a more private outlook when they make these decisions. For the INTP, the truth is an end to itself, so they have these internal ideals that they're pursuing for themselves, which is to create the most perfect design based on their own internal criteria, or to explore a new pattern or experiment with a new stack. And these things are self-serving in the sense that INTPs find them stimulating and it breaks the boredom of everyday work, but then it doesn't quite cohere with the larger environment of the methodologies and the frameworks that the company or the team uses. So in that sense, I find that I'm a lot more yielding to the status quo if it gets the job done. In cases where I find it problematic, I openly object to it and I can be very vocal to superiors about it. But in cases where it's working fine, I'm less likely to, not want to fix things that are working fine. Whereas INTPs tend to look for the best possible solutions, regardless of the relevance they bear on, business interests or the interests of the larger group. So for them, it's a very personal thing, whereas for me, it's just an impersonal decision. Owing to that, they tend to dedicate a greater portion of their mental energy into searching for the best decision, and that investment creates the sense of sensitivity towards the solutions that they create. So they're not as open to criticism. They're not as open to alterations, especially if someone pokes into their system and they find any kind of logical inconsistencies or incompatibilities between a professed methodology and their implementation. It really affects them really personally. So whereas with me, whenever I come up with solutions, I basically just present it to the group and I want everyone to hammer at it and break it down as much as possible. And that rigorous sort of testing by the group is my vetting criteria for the idea. So I actually welcome feedback a lot more than my INTP coworkers. The third issue is idealism versus pragmatism. So both INTJs and INTPs I found are idealists, but about different things. So for the INTJ, the ideals are about the world. So we can entertain an alternative arrangement of events where things are working a lot more efficiently. The systems are more working better, are optimal. We can think of a project getting done better with better quality, with less friction. And the way we approach this is by creating alternate versions of the system that's already there. So if it's project management or deployment or even human systems on like how people are grouped together, stuff like that, I can usually project an alternate version of the world that's better, and I work towards that. So my goals, my ideals are projected onto the world, and I care about optimal results. So that's that extroverted thinking, projecting a better world, a better system out there. So I'm willing to change methods, procedures, philosophies, frameworks to whatever helps me get there. Whereas with INTPs, their goals tend to be focused more on their self. So they have a very strong sense of self that's largely centered on their intuitive sense of their correctness or internal logical coherence. And part of that is they have these internal ideals of intellectual integrity and truth, and they seem to value rigor. And these are, from an external point of view, these all seem very self-serving. But the benefit is that they end up creating solutions that are innovative, creative, and usually show a great deal of thought into everything they do. But so I'm idealistic about the project, about larger things, and the INTPs find that impractical because they clearly see that I'm not in a position to make those changes. I'm not in a position to change how the company works or to go to a different department and give business advice because I'm a programmer. So they find my frustration at the system somewhat childish and impractical. Whereas conversely, I find that their internal ideals are not going to be exercised, in a real world scenario, because you have constraints like budget and time and energy and all these things that are part of business. And so it's hard to allocate time and justify the internal investment in those personal things. So I find those impractical, and that seems to be a point of conflict. Is it seems like they're working for themselves, for their internal ideals or internal stimulation or internal growth, whereas I'm working for an external, publicly observable result. But the vision is personal. Whereas with them, they don't. It seems like they don't really care about the result as much as just the process, for the most part. So that's another thing. Finally, it's the difference between sufficient versus optimal solutions. So for me, a project half done that serves a customer is better than a great project that never comes to fruition. And that's because I largely see intellectual output as just the first step, whereas INTPs see intellectual output as the final step. So they can create a fantastic design or architecture, but not really worry about the implementation details and just move on to something else. Whereas for me, that's just the beginning. So I'm a lot more focused on execution, and part of that means making pragmatic cuts to get things out the door. And I'm also able to factor in things like not just the expected, but the actual capacities of people, the track record of the company. I do risk projections of things that could possibly go wrong, and I try to make sure that we deliver on time, even if it's not perfect, right? Whereas with INTPs, they tend to be very obsessive about getting their personally valued component. So if they worked on one component or one design, just getting that part that's assigned to them, getting it perfect. But they can be less concerned with the whole execution. So like a good analogy would be, if we're building a car, the INTP will make sure that the engine works perfectly fine. That's the most complex part, so they're drawn to that, and they'll create an engine that lasts for 10 years. But I'll discover, I'll complain that the wheels are flawed, the transmission isn't connected properly, it's taking the wrong fuel, it weighs too much. So I have all these practical concerns trying to integrate with a larger system, and they find that kind of frustrating, it seems like. So that's another thing. Now, one of the things that I find when working with INTPs is I have this foresight mechanism where I sometimes don't consciously know the reasoning behind some of the concerns I have, but let's just say my intuition tells me to make certain decisions and I just trust it. And I present those to the INTP, and they generally find that it's a bit of over-engineering. Their initial reaction to that is it's not simple or elegant. But then 3 months down the line or 5 months down the line, it ends up saving the day. And so I'm a lot more confident with my internal guidance, which I can't obviously justify through conscious means at will, whereas they tend to want to exhaust any sort of arbitrary whim, or I guess eliminate any sort of arbitrary whim or any sort of subjective input from their decision making, such that by the time it makes it out and it's finalized per their judgment, it's perfect and defensible through language. So that's another difference. They seem to like it when it works. So they seem to like the foresight when it actually predicts stuff that nobody else can see. But generally they find it annoying because they think it's excessive, and they're generally a lot more optimistic towards the future than INTJs are, a lot where I am. So this excessive worry about what could go wrong and trying to mitigate, I guess, imaginary problems, it's exhausting for them. So they don't like it. It's foreign to them. The second thing they like about INTJs is the breadth of concerns. So INTPs, like I said, they like to abstract problems. So if they're dealing with any sort of complexity, the first step for them seems to be to just abstract it to a more fluid mental model, and then they like to manipulate it in their heads. So given that they have limited cognitive energy, they can only do that so much and on so many different things, that they kind of have this limited view where they divide a project or concerns into their own and others. So if they're building a software, like a web project, for example, they can care about the front end, the look and feel, and the CSS and stuff, but the deployment is someone else's problem. The performance is someone else's problem. And they're okay with a sort of specialized system like that. Whereas for me, I tend to look at things more holistically, and they appreciate that I have the capacity to do that. And even in areas that I'm not competent in, I can still evaluate whether or not it'll work. So I have a more holistic view of things, more top-down, and they tend to appreciate that. Finally, there's the issue of excitement versus stable stamina. So Generally, what I find with INTPs is they get really excited at the beginning of a project, and then their excitement kind of fades, or they find something new that's a little more stimulating, and they kind of switch gears towards that. So once they prove something on paper, they get bored easily, so they move on to something else. So they're likely to have a lot of projects they've started working on that they just never get to, and they just put it in their graveyard of projects and ideas and fantasies. And the thing that's frustrating to me is I see the potential for these, but since they haven't made it out into the real world, they're not really solving the problem. So it's as if they never really happened. So there's a certain loss in that for me. Whereas for INTPs, working on ideas, intellectual output by itself is an end in itself, right? So it doesn't need to be integrated within a social framework, or they don't need to create a product, or other people don't need to use it. It's as if they have a very academic outlook on problem solving. It's as if they think that the universe is better simply because this was like a certain problem was solved. Sharing it with other people, or integrating it with their surroundings isn't that big of a priority for them, it seems like. Whereas for me, as an introverted intuitive, I also appreciate the thrill of novelty, and I would like to, I guess, be relaxed enough to be in their mindset. But having said that, I'm a lot more invested and grounded in the real world, the world of people and existing processes and results. So working with the concrete world as it is and making observable concrete changes to it is more important to me than merely solving hypothetical problems. So that's where we differ with them, because they rely on that initial excitement to start working. They tend to overwork in the beginning of the project, and as they lose interest, their performance tends to decline towards the end. Whereas I have a more stable, sustainable stamina because I'm driven by an end in the future. So I'm willing to try many things. I'm willing to throw away projects that I've worked on and start over, as long as there's a clear vision that I'm heading towards. I can be very resilient, and I can provide very sustainable, predictable output. Whereas with them, it's planning with INTPs is a little bit of a gamble, because their interests tend to, boredom and excitement tend to affect them a little bit more than they do INTJs. So having said all that, I think INTPs are probably easier to be friends with than to work with. So some of my best friends are INTPs, and they're the type I can have the most intellectual intimacy with. So whether we're discussing philosophy or even our emotions, I feel safest with INTPs out of all the 16 types. So we're really good friends in real life, but when working together, when there's something at stake, there are these issues that come up. So so I kind of presented the diagnosis and the problems, and here are the steps that I've taken to kind of solve this. So the first thing is communication. So there's a common accusation towards INTJs that they're too private with information. They don't share enough, because we find we also project the consequences of that information. So at least in my case, I have to package information in a different container for different people, because there's a risk that they may misunderstand it, or they may read too much into it. So I have to factor in the reader or the subject when I share information. Whereas INTPs I have this sort of, I guess, what is in my judgment a naive outlook, which is that information should be free and shared, and you can never have too much information, right? So one of the things that I've found helpful when working with INTPs is to actually spend the time to articulate my reasoning behind it. And so, for example, if I'm going with a specific framework, instead of just saying this is what we're doing, actually spending the time to sort of provide some analysis, or in writing or in some other way. And given that they just naturally tend to respect some thinking over no thinking, the fact that there is some reasoning there, as opposed to it being some arbitrary decision based on whims, because that's what they fear, that in itself is a positive thing for them. So they appreciate that. So that's one thing that's been helpful, is with INTPs just writing things down. So at my company, I have a wiki where I document all the decisions that I make, and I just link to them. And in most cases, I don't think they even spend the time to read it, but the fact that it's there makes them feel safe. So the fact that they can refer back to it and, I guess, introspect it in the future helps them. So that's one thing that's helped. The second thing is being soft with INTPs. So contrary to the stereotype, INTPs can be quite sensitive, both to tone, but also to valid criticisms. So the stereotype, or I guess the the wrong generalization is that INTPs lack emotions or they're completely detached from their thought processes. In my experience, the ones who've typed INTPs and told me they're INTPs, while sharing all the other like external traits, one of the things that stands out is they're actually quite sensitive about their solutions, almost to the same degree that INFPs are sensitive about their values. So if an INFP makes some sort of moral judgment and I try to, I guess attack it, or maybe provide like a counter to it, they don't take that well. And similarly with INTPs, they have a strong sensitivity towards their solutions. It's almost like my thought, the tendency is like my thoughts are my babies, which is very different from how INTJs and extrovert thinkers generally work. Because for us, we know that we're all idiots as individuals, right? Our brains are prone to all of these biases and whims, and there's variation in our intellectual energy throughout the day. Some days we're tired, other days we're sharper. So the initial output isn't really that important or personal. It's the process, it's the external process that filters these thoughts and organizes them that matters. So we tend to yield to objective systems, things like review processes and objective criterion for evaluating things. And by objective, I mean it in the colloquial sense, where it's just like a shared system between people, like a formula or something like that. So when I make mistakes, or whether it's out of laziness or more commonly it's just paying poor attention to details, I'm a lot more comfortable admitting it, and I'm a lot more comfortable with accepting corrections. That's another difference. So yeah, having said all that, I think INTPs are great. So yeah, just documenting things, being soft with them, be gentle with them. Don't tell them, because the thing is, what I'm understanding is they don't compartmentalize their lives as well as INTJs do. So for me, in an ideal scenario, when I get off work, I can put on a different operating system and just function differently at home. I can just leave work at work. Whereas for them, if they make a mistake at work, it tends to be intimately tied to their sense of identity. So it can linger for quite a bit. So yeah, I'd say that those two tips have helped me. They also don't like to be so like one of the things that extrovert thinkers generally do is they have sort of like a good analogy would be beating something with a baseball bat until it can't, until there's nothing left anymore, just beating it to a pulp. Not like a live thing, but just as an analogy. And that's kind of how we deal with solutions, is we want to attack them from as many angles as possible, share them with as many people as possible, and if it survives a certain rigorous test that's been trusted, then maybe it's good enough. And this way we can sort of remove the individual factor, and it doesn't have to be subjective, it doesn't have to be influenced by all of these irrational factors that we're intimately familiar with. So for that reason, we tend to come across as abrasive, we tend to come across as rough. I think rough is the right word. And INTPs, given that they have extroverted feeling, a very weak extroverted feeling function, they tend to expect softness in communication. So generally not being blunt, not being loud, not being accusatory, and also just not even like directly contradicting them. So a common thing I've seen, especially between ENTJs and INTPs, is the ENTJ will find some fact that the INTP has not considered, and it threatens the internal system that the INTP has. So they feel really insecure and uncomfortable. They feel like they're in the spotlight. In the INTP's internal sense, they've expended a lot of energy exhausting all the different options, and the solution that they've shared with others is the final one and the perfect one in their judgment. So if someone suggests a better solution and they don't deliver it right, if it's delivered right, they tend to yield very slowly, but they eventually yield. They'd have to reconstruct the solution from their point of view, but they usually if it's clear and measurable, they usually yield. But it's hard; it takes them a while. But if it's not delivered that way, and let's say it's a meeting scenario where we have limited time and there's no point in justifying it because the solution is obvious for the majority of the people there, then they tend to be very defensive about their ideas, and so it's important to be gentle with INTPs. So I think those are the main things. I hope this was useful.